On February the 4th, 2019, POTUS 45, I don't like to call him by his name, which Trump, okay, acknowledged two former incarcerated Black Americans during the State of the Union address, or SOTU. Matthew Charles and Alice Johnson had both received draconian sentences for drug trafficking and were granted early release. Ms. Johnson served 20 years of a life sentence for a first-time nonviolent offense. She publicly accepted responsibility for her crime and shared that her loss of a child, lack of funds to care for surviving children, and pending home foreclosure led to poor judgment. Kim Kardashian West heard of Johnson's case on Twitter, called presidential advisor daughter Ivanka Trump, and set up a meeting at the White House. 1 week after Kardashian West lobbied President Trump in the Oval Office, Kardashian West, not the warden, not a state official, contacted or called Alice Johnson at her Tennessee prison and told her that she should pack because she was going home. Both women referred to 45 as compassionate. A monarchical or dictatorial president, in my opinion, infamous for anti-Black animus, achieves as an abolitionist what he opposes Black or progressive organizations for doing for their own communities, becoming the architects of mass abolitionist movements to free the imprisoned, both the activists and those who are not traditionally considered to be activists. Opposing progressive movements to free captives, political economic elites with documented affinities to white supremacy are now our benevolent abolitionists who understand that they get to choose which subjugated individuals they deem worthy for release. Jared Kushner, Donald Trump, the Koch brothers do not publicly atone for their alleged crimes or antisocial behavior, which would include racist housing practices, tax avoidance, labor exploitation, environmental destruction, because no one yet, including the people or the community, can force them to do so. While Kardashian, West, and Johnson describe 45 as compassionate, journalists remind them that Donald Trump called for the death penalty for drug traffickers and as well as for the exonerated Central Park Five. The First Steps bipartisan legislation signed by Donald Trump helps, and I'm not disavowing that. It makes the reduction of disparities in drug sentencing retroactive, revises mandatory sentencing, enables time credit and work programs. The 180,000 federal prisoners out of the 2 million incarcerated will have to wait to see how the executive branch or the Department of Justice interpret and enforce the new law, but the new law has value. I want to argue, though, from there as I move on to Angela. And then I want you to push back in the Q&A, so I'm not going to take up all the time. There's a strong possibility that since we never agreed to evaluate an ideological spectrum for our struggles against abolitionism, that everything and anybody at any time can claim to be an abolitionist. So now the President of the United States is an abolitionist, just as Van Jones is an abolitionist, just as the Koch brothers is an abolitionist. And that's the logical conclusion of de-radicalizing the prison struggle. By severing it from a grassroots, working class Black base or people of color base that sought autonomy from the state, and by shifting the leadership to elites, to government, to nonprofits, to academics, so that the very definition of the term of abolitionism is not decided by the people who are incarcerated or more vulnerable to the incarceration matrix. It is decided by the people who are part of the machinery, both its critics and those who celebrate it. And this then brings us to Davis and to George Jackson, which makes it complicated. So I'm going to stop reading because it's complicated. So I don't know how familiar you are between the relationship between the two of them, right? Fairly familiar? Okay, so Angela Davis, as I said before, was never a member of the Black Panther Party. But if you read her memoir, she says that she was a member of the Black Panther Political Party, which is B with 3 Ps after it, right? But at some point in the memoir, 1 P drops off, and you just get the BPP. So your reading is not that she was a member of the Black Panther Political Party, which was a study group like you have on campus, right, for intellectual and grad students, but you remember the Black Panther Party, which is Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, Second Amendment right, the police are killing us, we have the right to fight back and defend ourselves. Those are two different worlds, right? They will both claim to be radical phenomena. But this is where I'm in a quandary. If they're equally radical, then what is the definitional norm of radical struggle? A study group, right? Or having a 15-year-old be shot in the back in 1966 so that Bobby Seale and Huey Newton say enough is enough, we get to arm to defend our communities. And we encourage the people to come out and bring their guns as a performance piece in part, but also as a messaging, right? For the right to autonomy, the right to sovereignty, and just the basic right to life. So when Davis enters, right, as a graduate student who's left Europe to come study with Marcuse, she wants to participate in political struggle as we all do. And so there's a lot about Davis's life that's attractive because Davis resonates, I believe, with academics, because Davis is an academic. She was coming to finish her doctorate. And that, you know, I don't know how, you say raise your hand or not, but how many of you are actually in that same cycle, right? Of reinventing yourself as a professional intellectual who will then be on payroll and who's on a career track. And it doesn't mean that you're not political. It all just means that you don't live in impoverished neighborhoods, even if you came from them. And the way you see politics and experience it, increasingly there becomes this divide. So when Davis announces, after she's outed as a communist, right, she refused to denounce that deny that she is a member of the Communist Party USA. And that's how, while she's teaching at UCLA, that her job is placed in precarity. And there's something very heroic about that she will not renounce her political beliefs, that she's aligned to a party. She joins a section of the CPUSA that's formed by Charlie Mitchell. So it's the Che Lumumba Club. So it's an all-black club of the Communist Party because Davis won't join an all-white club or integrate it because she wants to join a black struggle. But once she loses her job, she wants to stay engaged, and she's asked to join the Soledad Brother Defense Committee by Faye Stender, who's a white Jewish attorney who's the attorney for George Jackson, and before that she'd been an attorney for Huey P. Newton. And this is where George Jackson looms large, but he also disappears at the same time. And when George begins to recede, the revolutionary era begins to recede with him, right? So George tells Angela, he writes to her, he's like captivated by this story of this first black instructor in philosophy at UCLA. You lost your job, how does this happen? He starts writing to her, you stay strong, she's an anti-racist organizer, she's moving through the community. He writes to her, they start a relationship. She's on the Soledad Brother Defense Committee. We need to save his life. The Soledad brothers are accused of killing a prison guard. But that's only after O.P. Miller, who served time in Vietnam and who was a sniper, killed 6 black unarmed men in the prison yard. And then a prison guard was thrown, a white prison guard was thrown over a railing, died, but nobody who saw who did it, but they identified the activists, right? Which would be George Jackson, Fleeto Drungo, I'm mangling his name, and John Clutchett. So Davis is swept into these defense committees the way we're swept into Free Mumia. You've all been there at some point, right? But she begins a personal relationship with George. And so George convinces her, because she has death threats, that there's only one person he would trust as her bodyguard. And that's going to be his 17-year-old brother, Jonathan. And Jonathan will have access to Davis's guns. And Davis has guns because she grew up in the South where everybody had guns because you needed to deter the Klan. And so there was a pragmatic aspect to armed self-defense in the Deep South in the 30s, 40s, and 50s that somehow in the 60s and 70s becomes romanticized by some and demonized when this was just a way of life. You had guns because you hunted, and you had guns because you planned to keep your family alive. And it wasn't, you didn't have to quote the Second Amendment rights. It was an insurance policy that you pursue, right? So Davis has weapons. Jonathan has access to them. Jonathan does the raid on Marin County Courthouse in August 1970. Black Panthers are supposed to come and support him. They do not show up. So you have a 17-year-old organizing what is supposed to be a PR moment, right? To bring attention to the plight of prisoners. What brings the cameras? Violence, or the threat of violence. That's when the TV crews show up. California at that time had a mandate. There would be no escapes of any prisoners whatsoever, and all casualties would be approved, including casualties of civilians. So if you look at Bettina Aptheker's scholarship, she makes it clear. Everybody who died that day was killed by prison guards shooting into the van, or by the district attorney who was taken hostage and who probably shot Jonathan first, took a gun, and began shooting everybody else in the van, right? So you lost 2 of the Black prisoners, you lost Jonathan, you lost the judge, you had the DA crippled for life, and you had some injured jurors. But Angela is going to be marked with this. And Davis's fear is that even though she has class, even though she has educational pedigree, she has vulnerability and risk, so she goes underground, right? And that becomes the fugitive flight of Davis. But before we get to that fugitive flight, we have to talk about the significance of George, right? Because I'm going to argue that after 72, Davis walks away from George, because it is no longer tenable to be associated with this type of revolutionary struggle or this type of revolutionary imagination. So when George does Soledad Brother, Faye Stendard is the one who conceives of the book because she's trying to save his life. And by the way, all the Soledad brothers were acquitted, but George, as we know, was killed in 71, in August, right? Jonathan is killed in August 1970, George in 1971. If you read George, there are 2 Georges. There is the George in print that white liberals need to embrace so that they don't fear Black revolutionary struggle, and they don't think that it's a homicidal intent. So Stender annoys George, and that's probably downplaying it, by writing him or editing his letters in a way so that he does not seem so violent. But this is one of my arguments. In Stender, we could talk about how she died. It was very tragic. But this is one of my arguments. When we attempt to refine the incarcerated and launder their language and their desires and their passion and their rage, we're presenting an artificial product for the consumer. And what we're doing, which is even worse, is we're minimizing the violence of the state. Because if you saw how deep that rage was, you would have to ask yourself, what sparked it? And then it would point to the violence and brutality of the guards. It would point to what W.L. Nolan said, which is a close friend of George, who was assassinated, one of those 3 shot in the yard, who was going the right route. He had a lawsuit against the prison authorities. They were putting broken glass and fecal matter in the food of Black prisoners. They were letting the Aryan Nation go into their cells and brutalize them. They were letting the Aryan Nation kill them in the yard, that they understood to be a state of war. And in a state of war, they understood that they had the right to protect themselves. And so when Davis is accused of abetting Jonathan, which she did not, because she's a member of the Communist Party, which is legalistic and wants to in some way influence the Democratic Party, she's forced underground. She still has allegiance and ties with George until she's captured and put on trial. The last thing that Davis writes, right, to George in terms of her letters is her fantasies of fighting with him against the police. And that is the literature, that correspondence has to be suppressed at her trial. Because what the state has to demonstrate is that this woman with this educational pedigree, who can be an academic in a University one, or who turned down Yale to go to UCLA, could never be like a, quote, street thug like George. And that literally becomes, on some level, the defense, right? So the radical ideology has to disappear during the trial. Ruchell McGee, who's originally her co-defendant, who was one of the men in the van, His trial is severed from hers because he's making a defense from the street and from the space of revolutionary argument. I am captive as a slave. I have the right to rebellion. Davis's argument has to be, I am innocent. Those are two distinct arguments. And I don't fault either one. I mean, obviously, if you don't want to spend the rest of your life in prison, the argument that I am innocent when you're technically innocent is a solid argument. But my argument myself about the end of the revolutionary era is that with her acquittal, you find this celebratory moment that justice works. And from that acquittal in '72 to the National Alliance Against Political Repression, to the birth of critical resistance with funding for nonprofits, to embedding abolitionism in the academy, you are drifting away from the ground, the terrain of suffering and sorrow and rebellion that actually created this template. And so what we get is some derivative of a desire of being free that we no longer can articulate. Because our language itself belongs in the academy, our imagination itself belongs to the academy, and our funding itself tells us to applaud President Trump, right, for being an emancipator, when we know, in fact, that he's the opposite. And that's sort of the larger picture that I want to present to you as the project, right? That the architects of revolutionary abolitionism have been turned into commodities, or they've been buried with a kind of scholarship that disparages them as paranoid, but that I hold with Cleaver, that these were pragmatists. And this is not an argument for armed struggle. This is an argument for a clear analysis of how violent the state is, its refusal of Black freedom, and its ability to manipulate our own desires to turn them into commodities to sell back for us in terms of our own consumption. So I'll stop there.